ask more explicit questions on the points that you've made.
Fine.
And I will presuppose that people have already seen these lectures. They're going to be uploaded as well.
Okay.
So it's like 4 questions. I will start with the first one.
We do one at a time.
Yeah. So you talked in the lectures about of a solution in terms of bypassing capitalism through the appropriation of management by the employees in every enterprise. To begin with, whether someone agrees with you or not, it is important that you do pose a proposal and a solution to be discussed, and this is something that intellectuals do not do very often, at least in Greece, I don't know in America.
No, same in America.
Yeah. So we would like to open a discussion here in Greece as to the solution and your proposal in particular. My question here will be very specific. Regarding this appropriation of the management by the workers, my personal fear, so to say, is sectarianism. You're aware of the fact that groups of employees and even whole professions tend to make decisions in the light of their own interest, and also that these interests are very specifically defined in terms of their financial benefit and not regard to what is right for the rest of the society and so on. In Greece, this happened very recently with the decision of the judiciary to raise their salaries, for example. They had the right to decide, and they did. So how can we safeguard a new emerging political system from that? That's the one. And also, what would you more specifically say about this issue when the production of the enterprise concerns the whole of the society, as in public transport or telecommunications, for example? Is it reasonable that only the workers of such enterprise decide about the outcome of their job when there are implications for the whole of the society?
Okay, that question is a very good question, very appropriate. My answer would be a little bit detailed, but allow me. And I'll come at it in a perhaps a little bit unorthodox way. I think the effort to institute political democracy, to have a representative system based on where people live, what we call in the United States a residential democratic system in which people vote according to the neighborhood they live in and they elect representatives and all of that, that this has failed systematically to introduce any genuine democracy. And the reason, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons it has failed, one of the reasons so many people are alienated from the democratic process, for example, in our country, more than half the people do not participate in the elections, for example. They don't care about their representatives, and a vast majority are uninformed about and uninterested in the entire process. That this is not a failing of individuals, this is really much more a failing of a system. There has to be a reason why people do not participate in a meaningful way. I stress this because one of the reasons this is the case is because there is no genuine democratic control or participation in the most important activity of an adult person's life, and that's called work. The vast majority of people get up in the morning 5 out of 7 days a week and go to work. They spend 8 hours, they're active 8 hours of the day or more, using their brains and their muscles to do a job of one kind or another. And they do it in an enterprise in which there is no democratic participation. Beyond doing their particular task, they are not only not invited, but they're not permitted to participate in the decisions about what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the rewards of production, and the gains, the profits, however you put it. And if people are denied the democratic participation in their work life, it is highly unlikely that they will suddenly develop a passion for democratic participation in their residential life. So I would argue that one of the virtues of this proposition, and the way I would like it to be seen, is an attempt to produce a genuine democracy in the political realm by introducing a democracy in the economic realm. And that allows me, if you see that connection, to then say it is not part of this proposal that workers in an enterprise be allowed to make decisions independently from people in the larger community, from people in other enterprises. The whole point is to introduce a democratic decision-making and a democratic operation of enterprises that become interdependent with democratic representation and organization, where people live, and when one enterprise and another, and between each enterprise and whatever state apparatus is left. So that nobody is going to give to workers the kind of independent authority and power that is now wielded by the existing organization of production. See, a corporation now organized with a board of directors responsible to shareholders is indeed able to make decisions that are advantageous for itself without regard for the impact, the social impact. That's what has to stop. As part of the democratization of the organization of enterprises, as a key feature of this kind of recognition of interdependence. Let me give you a concrete example. Because every enterprise's decisions impact the community around it, no decision could be made by any democratic enterprise without the participation and agreement of the interdependent communities around it, and vice versa. So, for example, the decision to raise wages at a factory, which would have, for example, impact on its profits, and therefore what portion of the profits could be paid as taxes to the community where there are schools and hospitals that live off these would have to be made interdependently. The people living in the community must participate in the decision about wages, just like the decision in the community about allocating resources has to have the participation of the workers. These are new ways of organizing a democratic society that would require being worked out. That will take time, but it is not the idea to replace the current autonomy of the enterprise, which can make its decisions letting the chips fall where they may, with the results happening to the community has to live with it. To convey those to workers, that's not the goal. The goal is to create a democratic institution inside enterprises that then becomes interdependent with the larger society. And let me stress one thing. It has been a problem of socialists who have looked to the state to lead in the overcoming of capitalism. That when you ask the state to do this, you give, in effect, power to the state. That power can be abused, and has been abused, been a problem of the experiments with socialism and communism so far. One of the ways to deal with that is to make sure that whatever role is assigned to the state in a transition beyond capitalism, that there be a control on the state from below. Not only a control ideologically and politically, but, as Marxists, for example, would have to understand, a control economically. And if workers in collective control of enterprises had the control over the surpluses they generate, that would always give them a way to counterpose power to the state at the center. It would be the decentralization of an economic strength. It'd be workers in each enterprise who would have the surplus they produced, which they would be able to give or not give in negotiations to the state. But the state could not dictate to them in a linear way, because that would have to be worked out. It provides workers with the control of the surplus they produce, so that the state is dependent on them in a way that has never existed before. In fact, the analogy is we live in a capitalism where what the state does is dependent on the capitalist control of profits and surpluses. And this is a substitution of a collective control. And so I think it offers us a way to think about a much more democratically organized post-capitalist reality than we have been able to think about before.
Without abolishing the state also, as you mentioned.
Well, you know, I always liked Lenin's argument that the state will disappear when the need for it goes. I'm not sure when this will happen. I assume that for the transition period of an indefinite length, the state will be needed. So the importance is not to say, because the state has made mistakes and done terrible things, we don't want it. I think that's an attempt to leap over a complicated situation with an absolute reversal. life doesn't usually work this way. So I'm assuming we're going to need a state for a while, but I'm very concerned to learn from the history of the mistakes and the excesses of the state to create, in the process of social change, real, powerful, non-state, decentralized, local resources that will control and limit what a central state can do. And putting large groups of workers in collective enterprises, putting them in the position of appropriating the surpluses they produce and bargaining with the state over how these are used will create a countervailing force from below of the sort we have not seen existing before.
So it seems like we're talking about a powerless state, or a state where...
Limited. It will have power, but
it converges with the people and they
yes,
have the power.
It becomes dependent on the people. It becomes dependent on the people, not just for a vote every month or every year, but for the flow of resources. The state lives by having surpluses funneled to it. Workers produce a surplus. It's appropriate these days in a capitalist enterprise, and then the workers are taxed and the enterprise takes a part of the surplus and gives it to the state. We're now going to have workers who are in a constant position of producing but also getting into their hands that surplus. They will have to be convinced to part with it to the state. The state will have to meet the needs of these workers to keep that relationship going. That's a structural creation of dependence of the state on the local working class that we've not had before. And I think that gives us another reason to look at this option as something to be explored. And I would argue, a little bit immodestly, that it's not that this notion of transforming enterprise answers every question, solves every problem. It doesn't. But the remarkable thing is that it raises certain possibilities, offers certain solutions, and should be part of the debates that are going on now and the agenda for social change and progress in the world. The fact that it isn't is a serious criticism of the status quo.
More or less of what is happening right now in Greece.
Yes.
The same, I believe, as in every part of this political and economic system. Within this situation, and in order to change things, if we want to, we have to openly discuss between us about the society and the political system we wish to arrive to examine different alternatives and so on. At the same time, however, we're coming close to a very cruel political system. Some even call it dictatorship. Not only the one marked under the pretense of democracy, but a real one many are afraid of. What people in Greece who wish to react are facing right now is suppression, slander, imprisonment, and many other things. Demonstrating has become more or less forbidden in reality, even though protected by the Constitution. People are precautionary arrested these days before the demonstrations and are set free after the end of it. Forbidden chemicals by the EU treaties are being thrown directly in our faces. A worker just lost his one eye in the last demonstration. That's very important. And recently, 3 or 4, if we count correctly, people were killed in Marfin Ban, and that in many respects happened in order to stop the most massive and dynamic demonstration that has taken place in the last 3 decades. More than 250,000 people were on the streets that day. Nobody in the media said so. So the political system and the media and the propaganda have managed not only to blame the people for what happened, for example, in Marfin, but also to make the people blame themselves for it. And this is very crucial. I'm certain that they will prepare even more severe incidents and even killings in the future in order to legitimize the open dictatorship. That's my personal fear. And so, in the light of this, the question is, how are we, the people on the base, supposed to prepare ourselves in order to stop the measures that they want to impose on us within this militant environment, and make the debate within us that is necessary for a new society at the same time? How are we supposed to work on these two demanding tasks simultaneously?
Let me start a response by again establishing a certain context. The preferred way for capitalism to function is to provide everybody in the community in a capitalist system in which a small number of people appropriate the surplus of a large number of workers, which was what capitalism is as a system. It is secure to the extent that it can provide to the capitalists the surplus they are in business to get, and the workers with enough of a wage to enable them to live without strain, stress, anger, or danger to the system. What is happening now is first and foremost to be understood as the failure of this system to do what it needs to do to remain secure. It's because it cannot deliver the surpluses to the capitalists that they need to reproduce their situation, and at the same time provide massive people with what they need. Granted that what they get is not equal, granted that their needs are defined in complicated ways, but the system can't do that. It's breaking down, and so it must begin to do things that it wishes it didn't have to do. It is not the desire of capitalists to repress the standard of living of their workers. They're not stupid. They understand that any attempt to do that, particularly a strong, sharp, sudden attempt, such as is going on in Greece with cutting salaries and wages by huge amounts in a sudden way, this is always a destabilizing event for capitalism, which they try to avoid. So the first thing to understand is we're in a period when capitalism cannot deliver what it would like to deliver. Let me give a little detailed example. In every capitalist country, Greece in no way being alone, in every capitalist country, there has been now for at least several decades the following dilemma. The ruling classes of capitalism needing to rearrange the globe, it's part of what we call globalization, to organize production, need to get services, more services from the state, at the same time that they want to give smaller amounts of the surplus, pay lower taxes. They need the state to help them, and they don't want to spend the money because they need to develop new technology, they need to compete. At the same time, the mass of people want from the state services of all sorts for their needs, and they don't want to pay taxes either. In a capitalist society, the state is caught between the employers who want more and pay less taxes, and the masses who want more and pay less. This is resolved by the state in a peculiar capitalist way. It goes to the masses and says, okay, I'll give you what you want, sort of, and I won't tax you. And it goes to the capitalists, I'll give you what you want, no, I won't tax you. But of course, if you give them all what they want and you don't tax them, you have to borrow the money. There's no other way. So the state becomes more and more indebted to cope with the contradictions of its situation. For a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, you can do this. You can keep borrowing enough to resolve the contradiction until the day comes when you can't do it anymore because people will no longer lend to you because you look like you might not be able to pay it back. And by the way, why not? Because the masses won't let you find the money and the capitalists won't let you find the money. That's why you've been borrowing. When that day comes, as it is coming now to a number of countries that have done this, and eventually to all the countries that have done this, in that tension or contradiction, you will begin to see that the state will finally have to make a decision. And of course, the capitalists will now finally insist that if something has to be done, if we can't go the way we have, and let me remind you, the capitalists were always supporting the government in borrowing and borrowing. One of the reasons capitalists always supported the government in borrowing is that they're the ones who lend the money to the government when it borrows. So they win that way too. Now that it can't be done anymore, the capitalists want to suppress the wages of the workers rather than pay it themselves. But that's a contradiction because that destabilizes their own system. So what we are in is a situation in which capitalism understands, and certainly the leaders do, that they are in for a very difficult time as they reorganize capitalism to save themselves at the expense of the people whom they need and who, if they don't deliver to them, become a threat. In that situation, at the same time that they impose austerities on their mass population, they have to beef up all of the tools of control in case those masses react, in case those masses resist, in case those masses threaten them. They are going to develop the police, the military, the judicial apparatus to constrain and control this situation. But it's important to understand this as a sign that a system is no longer able to function in the secure and stable way that it thought it could, and that through a variety of mechanisms, including building up national debts, it had been able to do for quite some time now. So yes, I think we are in a time in which the ability of capitalism to function, to deliver the goods, as we say in the United States, is compromised. And I don't see any solution to that problem. I think capitalists are imposing controls on civil liberties and so on because they, like I say, and that's where I got it from them, they don't see a solution. Not only not now, but not next year and not 5 years from now. So they need to put into place all the mechanisms to control it if the masses don't accept the reduction of their standard of living as, quote, the solution. You have, in short, a building up of a systemic contradiction that is going to explode one way or another. And the ruling classes are doing, in a sense, what you would expect them to do. They're going to try to impose the solution by cutting the standard of living of the mass of people. And at the same time, they're going to protect themselves against the possible resistance, like a military operation. You go from the left, but you have people on the right in case that becomes necessary. The only sad thing for me, coming from the left, is that I don't see the mass of people mobilizing and organizing for their strategy as to how to solve the problem, an alternative. And that's why when I talk about it, I connect this to your first question, which was, what about this reorganization of production? Because the working class should respond to this not by an argument limited, we should have civil liberties as not. Of course we should. Capitalists also want civil liberties. They've only taken them away because they felt they had to. Our response should not be to fight for more civil liberties, and of course we do, but that's not a solution. The solution is to change the structure so that the contradiction between capital and labor is not working itself out this way. Were we to have a different structure, then the oppositional stance of capitalists and labor would be removed, the workers would be in charge themselves, and we could begin to solve these problems as a collective society without the intrinsic contradiction in which a small group of people have all the levers of power to solve the problem in a way that protects them and at the cost of everybody else.
Yes, but where should the focus be on the strategy of infrastructure, on fighting back the measures, on both simultaneously? I mean, how do you
both,
see
of course. You always fight for more democratic rights, for civil liberties, and all of that. You always fight for that. That's what people need. That's what people want. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of how. And so, of course, the argument I make is that you introduce as necessary to achieve secure civil liberties the kind of structural changes in a society that would allow you to rely on the safety of your civil liberties. We have a capitalist system that is proving to us that it's not a reliable foundation for civil liberties, because these capitalists who prided themselves a few years ago on being the standard bearers and the security for civil liberties and freedom and democracy, are demonstrating that when capitalism faces a problem, it is willing to get rid of civil liberties and democratic freedoms. The lesson then is you've got to have a different structure if those civil liberties are ever to be secure. What we're learning now is capitalism only allows civil liberties and democracy when it's profitable for them to do so. And when they have problems, and particularly when those problems are severe, one of the things they do to support themselves is to dispense with the civil liberties and democracies they used to so proudly proclaim as their commitment. They don't have that commitment. That's an argument for a different system that will be a better basis for us to secure those rights.
Let's go to another question and problem here. In Greece, the majority of the intellectuals, so now we go to your special ground, to put it bluntly, have shut their mouths long time now. And it is only recently that some of them have started stressing a few parameters of what is going on. Now that is already too obvious. So I have a personal example. I myself published a book 1 year ago about what is really going on in that country. And many people congratulated me on the grounds that, as they said, I had the courage to say it out loud. That was a reason to congratulate someone, that someone speaks. Which means that many people know, but few speak about it. The left, on the other hand, is playing a very dangerous game here in Greece. Either they are trying to control people's rage and reactions, playing the opposition card, yet in full accordance with their political colleagues, or they are just incompetent and driven by micro-political desires and drives. That reminds me of Germany in the early 30s and the rise of fascism in Europe. And we see that in Greece right now. PASOK is in close coalition with the extreme right-wing party Laos. So that's the one thing. On the other hand, it is my estimation that people in Greece are both ready and willing to react. Not all, of course, but certainly a critical mass. And we do know that it takes a few to begin the game. Yet they feel lost. They wish for someone to take lead, to pose a proposal, something. So two questions here arise. One, a brief one, is if this is the same in the US with the left and the intellectuals. And the second, more crucial for us at this moment, is that do you have any idea how to bypass all this leadership and party-driven politics and organize ourselves in terms of the information needs? I mean that, you know, that without some level of organization and synchronization, we can't accomplish anything. So, what's your idea about that?
Multiple questions here. Let me try to deal with them each quickly. First, you are right. It is really the same in the United States. I think our intellectuals and our academics are mostly compromised, or to say the same thing a different way, they are well integrated into the general system. The university functions that way. It is an institution that is economically dependent on the rest of the society. It is politically dependent. It would be bizarre to expect it really to be all that different from the rest of society. Universities like to pretend that they are independent places, free of the rest of society's limits and pressures. That may have been true at some point in the history, but it's certainly not the case now. And as a result, I think you will find in the university many of the pressures that will make professors conform to the ruling opinions and the ruling authorities, just as people in other institutions, in business, in the law, and so on, also do. So that, in a sense, is the bad news. The image of the professor as the independent social critic is an ideological illusion and has not been true in the United States, for sure, for a long time. At the same time, the contradictions that affect workers, that affect students, that are also at play in the university, and that professors are very particular in how those contradictions play themselves out. For example, if you are a professor, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, and you are schooled in the ideologies of capitalism, such as, for example, the importance of democracy and the importance of freedom and things like that, then you are a little bit more sensitive than other people might be when those are confronted and contradicted by the way the society works, number one. Number two, if you develop in the university, you have the ideology, because it's peculiar to that institution, that what you're doing is particularly socially important. The next generation of young people must be educated to continue the traditions and to develop the progressive growth of our society. You believe all of that. And put aside for the moment whether it's true or not, it is the self-image of the academic. How then do you react when the state or the private sector decide that it's time to have fewer universities, fewer students, less salary for the professor, less support for the professor? You are offended, you are angry. How do you express it? Well, if you're an academic, one way you express it is to begin to recognize that there may be a contradiction between the way the society is working and all of those wonderful ideals you've been teaching. And so it becomes possible that the way the contradiction works itself out inside the university is to create social criticism. It's in a way the parallel inside the academic world of what will happen in a factory or in an office, where somebody, one of the workers whose salary is cut, doesn't react by feeling bad and going home and drinking too much, but instead begins to think in terms of there ought to be an alternative solution to this society. And that happens with academics too. And so I think you can understand why in the university often the contradictions that are everywhere in a society may come to the fore a little sooner. Academics are supposed to provide ideological justification. Well, that becomes harder and harder to do when the society has more and more tensions and contradictions. So a certain number of professors are going to go the other way and demand that the society conform to the ideas rather than the other way around. Then there's the question, even more important, of the unique thing called the student. We should never forget that capitalism seems to need to take a large number of people, finish their basic minimal education, high school, preparatory, but before sending them into the world of work, give them a few years of a concentrated educational process when they are mature adults. That's a very interesting contradiction. Capitalism needs it, but that produces a peculiar group of people. People who have time, a certain amount of leisure, and are expected to read books, listen to intellectuals, explore ideas. This is a moment when social criticism has an audience that has the time, that is not yet working full-time job, not yet distracted by all the responsibilities of family. So you have here a particular constituency that may be open to socially critical ideas in a way that other parts of the community are not. And in many capitalist societies, for much of the time, students have been exactly that, unusually active, unusually open, unusually vulnerable, if you like, to a social critical mentality and a social critical movement. It may not last for many of them once they go to work. It's basically over. It may be superficial, but it's there, and it's real, and it's a contradiction that opens a certain kind of space. And so for me, yes, the university is a compromised institution, part of the society, woven into all of its other institutions, and yet there are some particular peculiarities of it that mean that the social contradictions can be explosive in a critical way that is important to protect. Just as it's important to protect the contradictions that give us opportunities in any other area of social life, like politics or like the military or something. The universities have their particular places of opportunity. It's symbolized here in Greece for me when it was explained to me that here across the street at the Technical University, a rule exists in Greece that the police cannot go in there. That's a very interesting idea. The police cannot go in there. That means that somehow in the contradictions of this society, where the police can go everywhere, there is a place they cannot go. That's a powerful idea of a space that's a little bit different from other spaces, where things are possible that are not possible elsewhere. And I think that not only can't the police go there, but it's an area that is a little bit more open to a social critical analysis and interpretation than in others, and that's very important for the left to understand and to make a response to that possibility. On the question of needing some people to begin a process, I could not agree more. As I've tried to explain in other places, a huge portion of modern society, certainly in the United States, and perhaps it's important for your audience that I make that clear, a huge number of Americans are leftists, are critical of capitalism, are against the foreign policy of the United States as a clearly militarized imperialist operation that they oppose in principle. They are for drastic changes in the burden of taxation. They want many more social services for people. They want better wages. All of the normal positions you associate with the left, masses of the American public support. At the same time that the left is strong in terms of the commitments and thinking of people, it is unbelievably weak in the complete absence of an organized expression. Our trade unions have been declining for 50 years. We now have roughly 1 out of 14 workers in the private sector are in any kind of union. The other 13 out of 14 are not in any union. Right? So unions are very weak, very small. We have no Communist Party to speak of, a tiny organization with absolutely no social influence. The same is true of our Socialist Party and the 15 little splinter parties that are all tiny and without significant social influence beyond a very small part of the left that it can talk to. So basically, we have no organized left. We have a left that wants organization but doesn't have it. We also have a left that not only wants organization because it needs to express itself and feels unable to, but it is also a left that is terrified of organization, fearful that any form of organized effort will become corrupted, will betray the hopes that bring it into life. And so you have this mixture of we want it, we fear it. We need it, we resent it. This is a contradiction that immobilizes the left. It deepens the frustration because the left views are there, but they have no expression. You can see, for example, that it produced an immense outpouring of left support for Obama, as the left gave Obama an interpretation that he was a leftist. He never was. To be fair to Obama, he didn't pretend most of the time that he was. A few times he said things to get the left happy, but basically if you looked at what he did, if you looked at what he voted for, if you looked at who his friends and supporters were, there's no leftism there at all, and never was. But the left needs so badly to have an expression, it imputed its desires to an Obama, who understood that it was useful to play to this to get the votes, which he got. Half of that left is now disillusioned with Obama. It took less than a year for them to discover that they had dreamed of a support that wasn't there. So the end result of this is nothing, in my humble opinion, is more important in the United States than for the left to find ways for small groups of people to begin to propose and develop organized forms, some modes of organization that could avoid the fear that the left in America has about organization and yet respond to the desire of the left to have some kind of influence greater than what it has now. Last point. There is a kind of left politics in America that does allow itself organized forms. We sometimes call it social movements in the United States. This is when groups of people can define a political project very specifically, very narrowly, and usually very locally. So a group of people in a city somewhere are outraged at the relationship between white people and black people, or they are angry at the absence of decent housing, or they are concerned about ecological damage in their region. They can mobilize people to be active on some issue. That works in the United States. It's local, it's got an immediate concrete problem, and it proposes some immediate action. People will do that. That they think of is clean, that is pure, that is honest, that is noble, and they will do that. They will work hard. But the minute someone suggests, you know, we could all get these different groups together and we could help each other. The feminists could help those struggling against racism. The two of them could help the environmentalists, and we could together work with the trade union. The minute someone suggests that, we are back terrorizing the left with the notion of an organization. It's almost as if the left has not yet overcome the trauma of the last generation, in which the left believed perhaps too much in the power of a unified communist party, socialist party, but also the trauma in which the right wing portrayed political parties as necessarily caricaturish, Stalinist horrors. And so we have a generation of leftists who look with such anxiety and fear at what organization could be, because the left overdid it and the right wing demonized it, that they haven't yet figured out ways of organizational expression that could go beyond the little individual local act. And that leaves a left in the United States deeply frustrated. It knows, in a sense, what needs to be done. It is very critical, but it feels isolated because it has no unification, and yet it is terrified about any effort to move in unification, and that's a very frustrating situation. I do think, however, the potential is there that whatever little group, and there are many in the United States who are aware of what I'm saying to you and trying to deal with that situation, sooner or later, one of the groups or more is going to figure out how to present to the American left an organizational form that will be a way for the left to believe it can move forward without the terror of organization. They'll figure that out. And at that point, my guess is you're going to see an explosive emergence of the left, of an organized left, onto the American political scene. It will surprise Americans, it will surprise Europeans, but they shouldn't be surprised. The image here is an image I can take from chemistry. If you dissolve a chemical, a powder, in water, what often happens is you get something which in chemistry is called a supersaturated solution. That's when there is so much powder in the water that it really ought to congeal into a crystal. But it needs something to be the catalyst, something to be the event that transforms the solution into something hard and solid. That's what we are in the United States. We have an oversaturated left, big left, a very frustrated left. It needs something. My hope is that that something will be a new organizational form. If you want my fear is it won't be a form that we need, but it'll be a charismatic individual who steps in. A person who, for whatever reason, is thrust by the historical moment and is in a sense, Obama did that a little. He was something new and different, a black person leading the country, unthinkable. And so the left, in its desperation, rushed toward him. Now they won't do that again. They understand. If they vote for him again, it'll be only because he's better than the other one, which is why they always vote for Democrats. But he won't be the messianic possibility. But it was a sign that somebody else might be able to figure that out. Maybe the next time we'll have a black woman or something, and the left will put all its hopes and dreams in that. My preference would be for a much more structural, organic, democratic group figuring out how to move in this situation. But
not the Messiah.
Not the Messiah of any kind. But I do think it's important to understand, having said all this, that we are in an immeasurably better situation in the left than we've been for 50 years. I'm describing a vast constituency. I'm describing a situation in which the constituency understands its own dilemma. It knows it needs an organization. It just doesn't know how to do it. It knows it requires one. It knows the limits of that form of activity it has been doing for 50 years. The local, the specific, the partial. It knows that's not enough. It just doesn't have the last step. But given the normal creativity of people, we'll find it.
We really hope to be pleasantly surprised by
Yes.
the US.
Yes.
We're looking forward to it.
Well, we're working at it.
You said in your lectures that the people in the US and in Europe, as I know from several friends, have their eyes on Greece right now with the hope that we will effectively resist. They're waiting, I don't know, something like a domino effect, or they're having their hopes on us. However absurd this may sound to us here, I can understand how maybe propaganda in these countries have directed people in a defeatist attitude or has created several other problems. So let us suppose for a moment that the Greeks do manage to organize and resist. Just suppose for a moment that they make social groups of solidarity, that they go on a general and lasting strike, that they make a plan for the future. Okay, let's suppose we're there for a moment. When and if that happens, it is my estimation, and I think that historical evidence points that as well, that the political and economic leaders of the world, like leaders of the US, of the EU, the IMF, all these organizations and bankers, will try to stop it. It will be even more imperative for them, provided that they already know that their people in Europe and in the US are ready to uprise as well. Mm. So in the light of this, it seems very plausible that they will provoke an incident in terms of what we've been discussing up to now, an alibi to suppress further, for example, a terrorist attack within Greece, or an international diplomatic incident with our neighbors. We've seen that happening before. We already know that NATO is transferring its troops. It has gathered too many troops on the borders of Greece, Albania, and Fyrom, former Yugoslavia. You're familiar with the acts of provocation. This is what is taking place right now internally. It does place externally. And so, provided that the Americans and the Europeans, the people, will probably never come to know what is really happening in terms of these incidents. Maybe we don't even. How do we expect them to help us at that point? And maybe this is a question that you can pose to the Americans when you go back. I'm asking that because it is certain that we will need their help in order for them to stop their countries from attacking Greece, even under the mask of Turkey, another country, whatever it is. So, will they be able at that point to help? And how do you see that?
Well, it's hard to look into the future, but let me respond as follows. I have been struck by the degree of interest in what is happening here in Turkey. Excuse me, terrible mistake. Yes, in Greece. Interest in the United States about what is happening in Greece. I find that remarkable because normally Americans are not that interested in what goes on in the rest of the world and not particularly interested in Greece. It's a small country, etc., etc. The only explanation I can come to, and that I've asked people, is that to a surprising degree, Americans noticed that in Greece some sort of struggle, and they don't know the details at all, but some sort of struggle is going on between the imposition of some sort of austerity on people and some kind of struggle against that austerity being mounted by people. That's because they go into the streets, which is often a very big thing for Americans. That changes everything. It's a major change when people go into the street. It is in the United States, and the Americans assume it is anywhere else. And then, of course, with the publicity about the people who died in the bombing of the bank, violence is a very exciting thing for Americans, and so that gets you a lot of attention too. But it is largely, I think, coincidental that it's Greek politics that gets there. The issue is imposing austerity and people fighting back. And the reason Americans are interested in that is because it's happening in our country too. In the United States, because of the way the society is organized, it is not the federal government that basically does this. It's the state governments. In the 50 different states, that's where the big impact is being felt by people. For example, in our society, education, schools, are not a federal activity. We have no federal schools. Schools are organized, administered, staffed, and run by the state and local governments only. So if they're going to be cutbacks of teachers, it's states and localities that do that. If they're going to be cutbacks in the police, state and local activity, and so on. And that's beginning to happen in all the states. That is, for example, in our biggest state in California, tens of thousands of teachers, social workers, police people, every kind of state employee being fired. Their wages are being reduced in a variety of ways. So that's where it's happening. So all Americans are aware of austerity because we already have it, aware that the political leaders are promising more austerity coming, so they're afraid about that. So any story about a society which is experiencing imposition of austerity and fighting back is interesting. So what people want to know is it possible to fight back? Is it possible to win? Now, Greece has already answered the question, is it possible? Because it's doing it. And the United States is a complicated place. It's terribly afraid of violence, but it is also fascinated by violence. It doesn't want it, but it finds it very attractive. It's very important that you understand, is it scary for Americans to hear that there was a demonstration where people were killed? Yes. But they also take the opposition more seriously because of it. If you don't understand that contradiction, you'll never understand American politics. The United States is a country that is solving the problems it has in the Middle East and the Far East by killing people. It goes to Iraq and it fights a war. It goes to Afghanistan. It believes in violence. It believes in violent solution. And it respects that. It trains its people to support our troops. Okay, you cannot control this commitment to violence to be just where you want it. So in a peculiar way, the very depiction in our press that there was a violent moment in the struggles in Greece means on a complicated level, it's more serious, it's more successful, it's more impressive. Even as Americans are horrified and frightened by the violence, they're attracted. Not at all unusual.
We go out burning
No, I'm not in favor of it, not at all. You need to understand the contradiction. You can pretend that Americans only find violence terrible, but that's silly. Look at our politics. You couldn't possibly have, our society believes that everybody ought to have a gun, and most Americans do. They believe that a gun is an important thing to have, to protect yourself, to protect your interests, to advance your interests, etc. My point is really only to say that Americans are intrigued that there is a struggle going on elsewhere in the world that's like theirs, about austerity versus resistance. And they're intrigued by the Greeks because the Greeks have been portrayed as making a strong resistance. And how do you know it's strong? Because there are a lot of people in the street and there's violence. That means it's serious. And you're taken seriously. And so here's the irony. In this little corner of the world called Greece, a struggle is being waged that is seen as the same struggle people have in a little town in California. So I can go, for example, and give a talk in such a town, and 100 extra people will come to my auditorium because, are they interested in Greece? No. But if I come and give a talk about Greece, and I say it has to do with the struggle of people against austerity, those people are concerned about that. They will want to know what happens in Greece because it'll have relevance to their own sense of what's possible for them. So I'm afraid I have to say, if the press in the United States were to portray what happens in Greece as the collapse of resistance and the success of the government, it will make Americans a little more hesitant to do something than they otherwise might. I think that's fair. If, on the other hand, the Greek workers and citizens fighting back against this, if that was able to develop, if that was able to be shown, not necessarily to reverse everything, but to make it less bad in austerity than it would otherwise have been, that will make Americans more likely to struggle themselves. Will it decide it? No, of course not. They will make those decisions depending on all the conditions they face. But Greece has become the symbolic moment. And to be honest, it would change. If over the next 6 weeks, stories about Greece fade, and instead a big focus comes on something happening in Portugal, in Lisbon, and people are moving in the street, then the interest will shift to Portugal. It's not about that. It's about wherever that struggle plays out. You can even see it in the United States, is that when there's a struggle in one state against something, it becomes national news, even though in other circumstances, a teacher strike in a little town would make no news. Now it's big news because teachers are everywhere discussing strikes and so on. So I think that Greece is, for the moment, in the center of people's attention. And I think that that's a sign also of a society that has fundamental problems to face. I think Greece is also being looked at by the other side. If you're going to impose austerity, if capitalism's contradictions mean that the capitalists cannot run the society the way they would prefer, with a comfortable population, earning enough money to be more or less secure and to be interested in dancing on Saturday night and having a nice meal with your cousins and not about social issues. You know, if you impose austerity on people, you put the social question on the table. It's the capitalists who do that. They don't want to do it, but they're forced by their situation. They're now worried. They don't want a backlash. They don't want the issue to become one of the social system, even though they're doing the major provocation to push it in that direction. And so I think they are very worried too. But their worry is both a weakness of the left and a strength. Will they use their apparatus to control the left? Of course. Will they try to squash resistance? Absolutely. But there's always the danger, the dialectic, the contradiction. If you impose violence, you also invite it. They're very afraid of that. They do not want to provoke more trouble. Their goal is by provoking whatever they may have helped to provoke here in Greece, if they did, I don't know. They hope to control the situation. But there's always the danger that you make that situation worse, that you anger people, that you commit them to make more problem for you. And the greatest danger for the ruling classes of Europe and of the United States would be to so provoke the Greeks by their attempt to control them that they have a massive fight back. That is very much in the back of their minds. We on the left may be concerned that they're repressing and controlling us, but we must never forget that they're also worried that we will respond and be able to respond, and that would be very dangerous. And they will make a deal with the left. They will give to avoid the bigger struggle. That's always there. That always has to be understood. There's always a debate in the ruling classes whether to push the masses harder or not. There are those who think we can push them harder, that's what we should do. And there are those who say, don't be crazy, you will provoke a backlash that's more dangerous than making a deal with them. That struggle is always going on. We will never know, because we're not in those meetings, what the balance there is and how each event is interpreted. But there are always those struggles. Let me give you an example of that talks about Greece. There's always a struggle between the creditor and the debtor. It's never correct to imagine that the creditor holds all the cards, the one who lends, and the one who borrows doesn't have any. It's always power on both sides. The power of the creditor is to withhold more credit, to punish you by saying, if you don't pay me back the way I want, then I'm going to really hurt you. The debtor always has the same power. You don't give me a better deal, I don't pay you back anything. That's always how it, in the United States today, millions of homeowners who borrowed money to buy their homes are being pressured by the banks to whom they owe money to make all kinds of concessions to them. The homeowners are saying, I'm not going to make those concessions, and if you don't make a deal with me to reduce my loan by 50%, then I'm going to declare bankruptcy and I'm not going to pay you anything. I'm going to walk out of my house, I'm not going to give you another nickel, you're going to lose a lot of money, and you're going to be stuck with my house, which isn't worth very much anymore. And so, to use an American expression, you lose. That's why a deal has to be made. The United States government has a huge program in which it brings together the banks who lent and the homeowners who can't pay, and they work out a deal. And most of the time that deal involves the homeowner having less to pay. And that's not because the homeowner has no power. It's because the homeowner has a great deal of power. He has the power to say, nothing you get from me. What are we going to do? Put 10 million homeowners in jail? Not going to happen. Impossible. So we got to work that out. Why do I bring this up? The European Union says to the Greeks, you owe 160 billion or whatever it is of national debt. Okay, they want to get paid. The banks that own this debt, the German and French banks and so on, they want to get paid. Sure they do. And you're Greece, you don't want to pay. Sure you don't. Now we have to work a deal. A deal involves you pay something, but you don't pay everything. That's what ought to happen. The whole world is mystified that it doesn't seem to have happened. It seems instead that the Greeks have said, okay, we'll pay. What? Debtors never do that. Debtors should never do that. It is understood as a normal procedure of business, at least in the United States, that when you get to the point where the debtor and the creditor can't, then they make a deal in which both sides give something. Not a deal in which one side gives nothing and the other side gives what's demanded. The mystery in the world, really, about the Greek situation is that you seem to have agreed that you will pay it all. And that you're so happy it's at a little bit lower interest that this is enough. This is not the way this would work out, to my knowledge, in any United States situation. In the United States, people are failing to pay their debts all the time, and you sit down and you work out a deal.
Bargaining.
It's a bargaining, absolutely. And it's politically, it's the analogy in economics of politics. There's a bargain. Does the ruling class want to impose austerity on the masses? Sure it does. Do the masses want this? No, they don't. Now we have to work a deal. But of course, each side wants to threaten the other, it should be, if you don't do what I want, I give you nothing. Well, the ruling class is saying to the masses, if you don't cave in, disaster will come. I see it here in Greece every day. If we don't do all this austerity, then that's what everybody always says. But that shouldn't be taken seriously. It's like the worker who says, if you don't come to a deal, I pay you nothing. Yeah, sure. That's what you say. We all know you're going to have to do something here. But there's a little bit of my feeling, a little bit in Greece, that there may have been a successful effort by the European Union, by the IMF, by Angela Merkel, by Monsieur Sarkozy, to claim, oh, if you don't do this, it'll be a disaster. And Greek people actually believe this? That's naive. That is extremely naive and very dangerous and utterly unnecessary. I can assure you that the last thing on earth, Merkel, Sarkozy, Strauss-Kahn, Monsieur Trichet, any of them, the last thing they want is to provoke the Greek working class to rise up and say no. The image of that to the workers in Germany, in Holland, in Britain, is much more dangerous than writing off half the debt of the country of Greece. If those people thought that you here in Greece had mobilized a resistance that would be an inspiration to their workers, they would cancel your debt. It would take, I don't know, 3 minutes for that decision to be made. There'd be phone calls, done. They are not going to endanger all of capitalism's programs in Europe. All of the future of the euro and the common market is much more endangered by a rising of the working class against austerity than by relieving the debt of the little country of Greece, whose GDP is 2% of the European community. They're not that crazy. But if they can convict the Greeks to cave in, to do nothing, well, of course that's even better. And they must be sitting there having champagne in Paris and Berlin at the imagination that perhaps Yorgos Papandreou would be the agent to make all this happen. That would be very convenient. They would like him a lot. That would be better. But they don't really hope for that. They don't. They expect there will be deals yet to make. And perhaps Mr. Papandreou understands, too, that this is all an elaborate theater in which you push the Greek working class as far as you can, and when you feel you can't push them any further, then you make the deal. And they're just at that early phase of seeing how far they can push. And so the question for the Greek working class, as for the American, how far do we let them push us? At which point do we play the card, you push us further and you'll be real sorry you did. At that point you will be tapping their worst fear because they don't want to push that further. It's not worth it to them.
Yes, but it is the people that have to say that.
That's
this
right.
is where organization comes to the fore.
Absolutely.
Because trade unions are already with
It's
PASOK for 20 years
That's
now.
right. But my guess is, I know nothing of course, but my guess is if PASOK and the trade unions in Greece are like the Democratic Party and trade unions in the United States, whatever they say they are all agreed on, they're not agreed. Inside those institutions, these tensions and contradictions are also played. It's a problem. I am sure, knowing nothing, I am sure that inside PASOK there are people not necessarily politically agreed with leftists, but worried about the future of their trade unions, their hold on the people, their political position here, that if they don't play this right, they're going to lose a lot of support. They're going to be blamed for an austerity. Imagine if the way I'm speaking were understood by the Greek people, that there's an austerity they didn't have to suffer. There's an austerity that could have been handled politically in a very different way, could have been limited in its damage, could have gotten much more concessions out of the Europeans than what. That's the end of Mr. Papandreou's career. If people felt that way, he would be seen as a failure, as the agent of the Europeans rather than the leader of the Greeks. He has to worry about that, and people in his party whose careers depend on the success of that party, they have to worry about it too. So you'll have struggles inside there, and a creative left in Greece should play on that, should speak to those people, should support the sense that we could, in our resistance, not only make a better deal for us here in Greece, but be an inspiration to the others. I'm not saying you do it in order to inspire American workers. I mean, that would be asking you to be noble beyond anything reasonable. But it is an interesting fact that you could benefit your own situation here as well as inspire the others. And let me make sure that you do understand that it will be used against you that way. If the Greek workers accept wage cuts, pension cuts, job security reductions, and so on, you may imagine, as the ruling parties will suggest to you, that if we bring our finances in order and we lower our wages, then European capital from Germany and France will flow to Greece and we will have an economic revival. That's naive to the point of almost stupidity. You can be sure of more of this that I'm about to say than of anything, that if the Greek workers accept cuts, the next day the German employers will go to the German workers and say, the Greek workers took cuts, they are now much cheaper than you. Either you give us those cuts or we will go to Greece. And having seen what happened, the German workers will likely accept those cuts. And that'll keep their jobs there and prevent any capital from coming here. So be very careful of anyone suggesting to you that the Greek acceptance of an austerity will solve their problem. No, it won't. It will just teach the employers that what was successful in Greece is now more likely to be successful everywhere else. And so everything will stabilize. There will be no improvement of the Greek situation because, in effect, you've brought down the situation everywhere else. So everybody in the working class will be worse off. That is their dream. That's their plan. And it's only a question of how the different working classes react to it.
Certainly we can't predict the future, but it sounds to me like maybe we shouldn't expect too much in terms of solidarity to Greece, but in terms of people reacting for themselves in their own countries.
Yes, that is the only assumption I think is reasonable to make, but it is at the same time true that because of a number of particular historical situations, that you had a big amount of your national debt that came due in the month of May, that forced the issue here earlier than in other countries, just because of how you scheduled your national debt. It could have been Portugal, it could have been Ireland, it could have been Spain or Italy, as we all know now. It happens to be Greece. It happens to be that the world is now connected by the internet and by telecommunications. So your struggle here becomes a symbolic moment for everybody else. So yes, each working class will, in each country, will still have to make its own decisions, but more than ever before, they are aware of and interested in and affected by one another's strife. International solidarity of workers is not going to happen because we believe it's a good idea. That's not enough. That's important, but not enough. It also has to become a practical, concrete issue, and that's happening. Modern technology is actually making American workers aware and interested of what is happening to Greek workers in a way they never were before. Never before have I ever experienced, people in the middle of America who really have no idea what Greece is or where it is, suddenly interested in this situation. That's an internationalization of class struggle in a very concrete way, happening alongside of the ideological commitment to that idea. I'm not saying it isn't important to talk about international. It is, and to raise the idea. That's what leftists do. But what we're seeing now is another source of internationalization coming out of the particular austerity programs. It's, by the way, another contradictory result of capital's difficulty. Capitalists have to impose austerity. Austerity, being imposed simultaneously in different places, brings the working class into a much more international. It's a wonderful illustration of the unintended consequences of a capitalist strategy to cope with its own difficulties. And let me end with that because it's a point I made at the beginning. whatever else is going on, this is a weakness of capitalism. It's an inability for the capitalists to provide enough benefits to the mass of workers in Greece, in Ireland, in Portugal, in Italy. Look at it. They can't provide, and they have to impose on their people suffering, contraction, threats, danger. They don't want this. This makes their working class angry. They have to spend more and more money on police. They don't want that either. The police are expensive, and the police are dangerous. They can overreact, and the police are not liked by the people. Nobody wants to pay for this. This is bad, bad, bad. They hope to thereby control for not having even worse. But this is their problem and our opportunity.
I suppose this is it. I mean, we could keep going with this
Forever,
conversation
yes,
forever,
yes.
and it's been very, very
And we should.
interesting.
And we should.
And we should do this again, and maybe we can come to visit you.
Well, let me ask you a question. Are we off the camera?
No, not yet.
Should we? Yeah.
Yeah.
Know, with a message that we would like you to transfer to your people, that we are uprising and we are going to react even more and more, and we are organizing. So let them be ready. If they are not ready to be solidary to us, just for themselves, because this is happening here. I don't know what they learn or what they hear, but this is happening. It's gonna get even stronger.
Well, good. I will convey that message. I am happy to. And I have gotten that understanding from others that I have spoken to here in Athens over the last few days. But let me ask you also a question. Is there anything you would like me to convey to the American people that would help you in your efforts to respond to the situation here in Europe of a global capitalist crisis that began in the United States and was exported to the rest of the world? And you don't want, if I understand correctly, you don't want the costs of a capitalist breakdown to be shifted onto the backs of the masses of people who really had nothing to do with that breakdown. Is there something you would like from Americans that would help you in your struggle against the costs being shifted onto the Greek people?
Well, I can't deliver a message on behalf of the Greek people,
Well,
but on behalf of myself, I would say I would ask them to uprise as well, and to make their problems, to fight for their own solution, and to deal with them within their own states. I mean, the United States consists of 50 states. If each one of these states came to address the issues for itself in 50 pieces, I don't think that the United States would have all of this time to mess around in the world as they do now.
Absolutely. I'll give you one example. On the 5th of March, a little earlier this year, we had an impressive mass movement started in California, organized among colleges and universities, students and faculty, against the savage cuts in the budgets for public education across the country. And in many other cities around the country, there were sympathetic marches by teachers, actions by teachers' unions. So there is already, in many of the states, a movement against the austerity there. And those movements are getting stronger. The austerity is getting worse. We expect, just so you know, that in the next year or two, there will be many more cuts made in social services by each of the 50 states. And let me give you one concluding story. In one state, I think I mentioned it at one of my talks here, in one state in the United States, we already see what a resistance might look like. In the state of Oregon, a little state north of California, you might think of Oregon as a small part of the country, a little bit like Greece is a small part of Europe. And the state of Oregon did the following. When the economic crisis hit, and thousands of people lost their jobs, and thousands of people lost their homes, and the revenue for the state fell because those people don't pay taxes anymore and so on, the legislature in Oregon, which is controlled by the left wing of the Democratic Party, passed a law saying, we understand we have less revenue coming to the state, but we are not going to fire any state workers, and we're not going to cut any state services. No austerity. And the way we're going to deal with it is we're going to make up the taxes we don't get from the mass of people by taxing corporations and rich people. I didn't make this up. This is Oregon. They passed a law in the summer of 2009. And after the two houses of the legislature passed the law, they sent the law, this is American politics, they sent the law to the governor, has to sign it for it to become law. So the governor signed the bill. So in autumn of 2009, it became the law of Oregon to tax corporations and to tax the rich. Under the law of Oregon, you can subject any law passed by the governor and passed by the legislature to a referendum where everybody gets to vote. And so the business community and the Republican Party forced a referendum so that the people of Oregon could vote on the question of whether or not they endorsed the plan to cope with this economic capitalist crisis by taxing corporations and taxing the rich. In January of 2010, the referendum was held. 1.2 million citizens of Oregon went to the polls to vote, and a clear majority voted for the bill. So it was passed by referendum. It is now the law in Oregon. No austerity, tax corporations, tax the rich. This is not a story about the Soviet Union or China. This is a story about the United States and how one small corner of it made a radically different decision. And one of the things I do is, as I move around the United States, I make sure everybody hears the story of Oregon. And I think you see there a struggle. You might be interested to know that most of the mass media in the United States said nothing about Oregon. So that most of the places I go to, people look at me because they've never heard this story before. But if you go to the internet and you Google Oregon politics, you will find all the sources you need to get the details about this remarkable situation. And I can assure you that many people in many parts of the United States would like to repeat the Oregon experience.
So let's conclude with this. We thank you very much for visiting our country, and we're certainly hoping that we're going to keep this collaboration going on because, as it seems, we face the same problems.
Yeah, I think we face the same problems. I think we depend on each other. I really meant it before when I said that the internationalization of workers' struggles, which is something leftists have always talked about, is now being concretely realized by the very processes of capitalism. It's sort of an irony of history. The critique of capitalism was produced by capitalism. The critique of capitalism is capitalism's own self-critique. It is as old as capitalism. And the pretense by capitalism that it could have a society in which there was no criticism is an attempt by capitalists not to recognize the contradictions inside that system that have always and will always produce their own negation. And as Hegel taught long ago, eventually the negation of capitalism will eventuate in a newer system which will have its own contradictions, but they will be different from those of capitalism and different in a way that I think most of us would prefer to see.
This is what Marx said, isn't it?
Yes. Marx was a Hegel student.
Thank you very much.